The people who bear the name Israel were commanded by their God to annihilate a tribe named Amalek. Every man, woman, child, and animal. And their first king refused. 3 centuries later, a man descended from that same tribe nearly succeeded in exterminating every Jew in the Persian Empire. The gallows built for the Jewish leaders stood 75 feet high. The decree went out across 127 provinces. The day of slaughter was chosen by lot. And the only reason the entire Jewish population was not erased from history is because one king, 300 years earlier, had failed to follow a command that no modern leader wants to defend. But that is not the story most people know. Most people know a territorial dispute. Most people know competing claims to land. Most people know the 20th century. And most people therefore miss the structure beneath it. A pattern written not in treaties or borders, but in bloodlines and refusals, in commands given and half obeyed, in seeds planted in mercy that grew into gallows. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a conflict that looks political is actually genealogical. Why it began not in 1948, but 15 centuries before that. And why every attempt to solve it without acknowledging that structure has failed. Friends, let's take a breath. No one here claims complete knowledge of the truth. Your thoughts matter. Write in the comments where you're from and what you do. It brings the picture to life. If this is interesting, support with a like and subscribe. Now, let's continue. The Kingdom of Israel emerged in a land already occupied. The geography was not neutral. The coastal plain belonged to the Philistines, iron-wielding, organized, militarily superior. The hill country was fractured into city-states, Jebusite Jerusalem, Canaanite strongholds, Amorite territories. The people who would become Israel were not an empire arriving with chariots. They were tribal, decentralized, holding territory through kinship networks and shared sacred law. Their unity was ideological before it was political. They served one God in a world where every other nation served many. That singularity was both their strength and their isolation. By the time Saul became their first king, around the year 1040 before the Common Era, they had no standing army, no central taxation, no capital city. Saul's kingship was a gamble, an attempt to survive by adopting the structure of their enemies. The Philistines had forced the issue. They controlled the lowlands, they controlled the trade routes, they controlled iron production and therefore controlled weapons. The text records that in Saul's time, there was not a single blacksmith in all the territory of Israel. When a farmer needed to sharpen a plowshare, he had to go down to Philistine territory and pay. The Philistines knew exactly what they were doing. A people without the means to forge swords cannot revolt. Saul's first campaign was not against the Philistines, it was against the Ammonites, a neighboring people who had besieged an Israelite town and offered terms. Surrender, and we will gouge out the right eye of every man in the city. Saul raised a militia, struck at dawn, scattered the Ammonite forces. It was a victory built on speed and shame, the shame of knowing that without a king, the people would have accepted the terms. The elders came to Saul afterward and confirmed him as king. But the confirmation came with a warning from the prophet Samuel. Kingship was a concession, not the ideal. A copy of the nations around them, adopted out of fear. Then the command came. The prophet Samuel came to Saul with a message that carried no ambiguity. The Lord had remembered what Amalek had done. When Israel was vulnerable, newly freed from Egypt, moving through the wilderness, the Amalekites attacked from behind. They struck the weak, the elderly, those who lagged at the rear of the march. It was not a battle, it was predation, and God had marked it. The command given to Saul was absolute. Go now, strike Amalek, destroy everything. Men, women, children, infants, cattle, sheep, camels, donkeys, leave nothing alive. It was not strategy, it was eradication. Saul gathered the army, 200,000 foot soldiers, 10,000 from Judah. He marched south into Amalekite territory, set an ambush in the valley, warned Kenites, a tribe who had shown kindness to Israel, to leave the area. Then he struck. The text says he defeated them from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is east of Egypt. It was total, it was devastating, and it was incomplete. Saul took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. He spared the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves, the lambs, everything worth keeping. He destroyed only what was worthless and weak. The army returned victorious. Saul set up a monument to himself at Carmel. He went down to Gilgal, and when Samuel arrived, Saul greeted him with confidence. "Blessed are you to the Lord. I have carried out the Lord's command." Samuel stopped, listened, then asked, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" There is a detail buried in the sources that most people miss entirely. The name Agag is not just a name, it is a title. It appears earlier in the biblical text, in a poem attributed to Balaam, a non-Israelite prophet hired to curse Israel. In that poem, Balaam says, "His king shall be higher than Agag." The prophecy was about Israel's future, but the reference to Agag placed him as a known quantity, a dynasty, a throne, a continuing line. Agag was not one man. Agag was a royal name, passed down through Amalekite kings the way Pharaoh was passed down in Egypt, or Caesar in Rome. When Saul spared Agag, he was not sparing one individual. He was preserving the continuity of a monarchy. He was allowing a royal house to survive. And there is another detail. The text does not say why Saul spared him. It does not give a reason. But later in the same passage, Saul admits that he feared the people. He listened to their voice. They wanted the spoils. They wanted the livestock. They wanted proof of victory they could see and use. Saul, the king who had been appointed to lead them beyond tribalism, bent to their pressure. But Agag, the king, Saul kept for himself. The people did not ask for Agag. That decision was Saul's alone. Why would a victorious king spare the defeated king? There are three possibilities recorded in the interpretive tradition. 1. Saul saw himself in Agag. 2 kings, 2 thrones, a professional respect. To kill a king was to admit that kingship itself could be undone. 2. Saul intended to parade Agag as a trophy. A living captive proved the totality of victory in a way a corpse could not. 3. Saul believed that mercy toward a royal prisoner was the mark of a legitimate kingdom. To slaughter a surrendered king was barbarism. To hold him captive was statecraft. All three reasons share the same root. Saul was trying to be a king in the way the nations around him were kings. He wanted the symbols: monument at Carmel, the captive monarch, the wealth distributed to his soldiers. He wanted Israel to look like a kingdom, and in doing so, he ignored the one thing that made Israel's kingship different. It was not autonomous. The king served a higher king. The command was not a suggestion. Samuel's response was surgical. He did not argue. He did not debate. He simply declared, "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Then Samuel called for Agag to be brought before him. The text records Agag's words as he approached. He said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." He believed he was safe. He had been spared on the battlefield. He had survived the march back. He stood now before a prophet, not a soldier. He thought the danger had ended. Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." Then Samuel hacked Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. The text uses the Hebrew verb shasap, which means to cut into pieces, to hew down. It was not an execution, it was dismemberment. A king reduced to parts. And it was done in a sacred space, at Gilgal, the site where Israel had first encamped after crossing the Jordan, the place where the old generation ended and the new began. The symbolism was absolute. What Saul had failed to do in the field, Samuel completed in the sanctuary. But Agag was already dead when the real consequences began. Saul did not know that 6 centuries later, the genealogies would still carry Agag's name. He did not know that the line he had preserved in a moment of royal vanity would survive, would scatter, would remember. He did not know that the Amalekites, though broken as a nation, would endure as a people without land, defined not by territory but by enmity. What Saul refused to destroy that day would spend centuries growing roots far from the land where Samuel had cut Agag down. The kingdom Saul tried to build fell apart within a generation. His son Jonathan died in battle on Mount Gilboa. Saul, wounded by archers, fell on his own sword. The Philistines found his body, cut off his head, stripped his armor, and fastened his corpse to the wall of Beth-shan. The people of Jabesh-Gilead, the same town Saul had rescued in his first act as king, traveled through the night, took down the bodies of Saul and his sons, brought them back, and burned them. They buried the bones under a tamarisk tree and fasted 7 days. It was a kindness for a failed king. But kindness does not reverse what has already been set in motion. David, the man who replaced Saul, built the kingdom Saul could not. He took Jerusalem. He centralized worship. He defeated the Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites. He established a capital, a priesthood, a treasury. And he did it by doing what Saul could not. He followed orders he did not like. When commanded not to build the temple, he stepped aside. When confronted by a prophet after his sin with Bathsheba, he confessed. David was ruthless, ambitious, and flawed, but he knew where the floor was. He knew which commands could not be bent. The kingdom endured for 4 centuries, then it split. Civil war between North and South, between Israel and Judah. The northern kingdom fell to Assyria in 722 before the Common Era. The southern kingdom, Judah, survived longer, but only as a tributary, a client state passing between the hands of Egypt, Babylon, and Persia. In 586 before the Common Era, Babylon destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, and exiled the population. The city was ash. The kingdom was gone. The people were scattered across the empire, Babylon, Susa, Ecbatana. No longer a nation, barely a community, holding on to identity through text and memory. It seemed the limit of horror had been reached, but the real blow had not yet been struck. In the Persian royal city of Susa, during the reign of Xerxes, the king the Hebrews called Ahasuerus, a man named Haman rose to power. The text identifies him precisely. He is called Haman the Agagite, son of Hammedatha. That word, Agagite, is not decorative, it is genealogical. Haman traced his lineage back to Agag, the Amalekite king Saul had spared. The line that should have ended in the valley near Shur had survived. It had no land, no nation, no visible power, but it had a name, and it had memory. Haman was appointed to the highest position in the Persian court, second only to the king. A decree went out. When Haman passes, all must bow. The entire population complied, except one man. Mordecai, a Jew living in Susa, refused. The text does not say he made a scene. It does not say he protested. He simply did not bow. And when asked why, he said, "I am a Jew." Haman noticed. Of course he noticed. A man in his position notices who does not bow. But the text records something more. It says that when Haman learned Mordecai was a Jew, he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He sought to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. One man's refusal to bow became the justification for empire-wide extermination. But that is not the full picture. The refusal was not random. Mordecai knew exactly who Haman was. The text makes it explicit. Mordecai is identified as a descendant of Kish, from the tribe of Benjamin, the same lineage as King Saul. Haman is identified as a descendant of Agag, the king Saul spared. 2 men, standing in a Persian palace, 6 centuries after the command was given, carrying the unfinished war in their blood. Haman went to the king. He did not name the Jews, he described them. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. Then he offered a bribe, 10,000 talents of silver, an amount so vast it represented a significant fraction of the Persian treasury's annual revenue, to fund the destruction. The king gave Haman his signet ring. The decree was written. Couriers went out to every province in the empire, from India to Kush, 127 provinces in all. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, all Jews, young and old, women and children, were to be killed and their property seized. The decree was irrevocable. Persian law, once sealed with the king's ring, could not be undone. The entire mechanism of the state now moved toward a single day of slaughter. And the Jews had no army, no king, no political leverage. They were a dispersed minority in an empire that had just legalized their annihilation. Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the center of the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. In every province where the decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, fasting, weeping, lamenting. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The text does not describe panic, it describes mourning. The people were not preparing to fight, they were preparing to die. But Mordecai had one piece of leverage. His cousin, a young woman named Esther, was in the royal harem. And not just in the harem, she had been chosen as queen. The king did not know she was Jewish. Mordecai had told her to conceal her identity. Now he sent her a message. Go to the king, plead for your people. Esther sent back a problem. Anyone who approaches the king without being summoned is executed, unless the king extends his golden scepter. And the king had not summoned her in 30 days. To go to him unbidden was to risk immediate death. Mordecai's reply was cold and precise. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The logic was blunt. Your survival depends on theirs. Silence will not save you. If you do nothing, God will intervene through someone else, and you will be counted among the dead. But if you act, perhaps this was always the reason you were placed here. Esther asked for 3 days. She told Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for her. No food, no drink, for 3 days and nights. She and her maids would do the same. Then she would go to the king. And if she perished, she perished. 3 days later, Esther dressed in royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, directly in the king's line of sight. The text slows down here. It notes that the king was sitting on his royal throne facing the entrance. He saw her. He extended the scepter. She approached and touched its tip. The king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." She did not ask immediately. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet that day. They came. The king asked again. She delayed again, invited them to a second banquet the next day. She was buying time, but she was also doing something more subtle. She was isolating Haman, elevating him, making him feel secure. The text records Haman's reaction after the first banquet. He went home joyful and glad of heart. He boasted to his wife and friends, "Even Queen Esther let no one come with the king to the banquet she prepared but myself. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king." But then he saw Mordecai at the gate, and Mordecai did not rise or tremble before him. And all Haman's joy turned to rage. His wife and friends gave him advice. Build a gallows 75 feet high, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go to the banquet joyfully. Haman loved the idea. He had the gallows built that night. That same night the king could not sleep. He ordered the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, to be brought and read to him. The text does not say why he could not sleep. It does not attribute it to God directly. It simply records the fact. The king was restless. And in the reading, a passage surfaced. Years earlier, Mordecai had uncovered a plot by 2 of the king's eunuchs to assassinate him. Mordecai had reported it. The plotters were hanged. But Mordecai had never been rewarded. The king asked, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" His servants said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king asked, "Who is in the court?" It happened that Haman had just entered the outer court. He had come early to ask the king about hanging Mordecai. The servants said, "Haman is there, standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." Haman entered. The king asked him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" Haman thought to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" So he answered, "Dress him in royal robes the king has worn. Place him on a horse the king has ridden, with a royal crest on its head. Let one of the king's most noble officials lead him through the city square, proclaiming, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" The king said, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, and do this for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing you have mentioned." The text does not record Haman's response. It simply says he did it. He dressed Mordecai in royal robes, led him on horseback through the city, and proclaimed his honor. Then Haman rushed home, mourning, with his head covered. His wife and advisors, hearing what had happened, said, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." They were still speaking when the eunuchs arrived to take Haman to Esther's second banquet. At the banquet, the king asked Esther again, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request?" Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. The king said, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" Esther said, "A foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman." Haman was terrified. The king rose in anger and went into the palace garden. Haman stayed to beg Queen Esther for his life, because he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the garden, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" The eunuchs covered Haman's face, the sign of a man condemned. One of them, Harbona, said, "Moreover, there is the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, standing at Haman's house, 75 feet high." The king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. But the decree was still in effect. Persian law could not be revoked. The 13th of Adar was still marked as the day of slaughter. Esther and Mordecai went to the king again. Esther fell at his feet, weeping, and begged him to avert the evil plan of Haman. The king extended the scepter again. He gave them permission to write a new decree in the king's name, sealed with his ring. Anything they wrote could not be revoked either. Mordecai wrote the decree. It granted the Jews in every city the right to gather and defend themselves, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, including women and children, and to plunder their goods. The same day, the 13th of Adar, the Jews were authorized to do to their attackers what their attackers had been authorized to do to them. The couriers went out in haste, mounted on swift horses bred from the royal stud. In Susa, Mordecai went out from the king's presence in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. The city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. In every province, every city, wherever the king's command reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, because fear of the Jews had fallen on them. On the 13th of Adar, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to gain the mastery over them, but it was reversed. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities to lay hands on those who sought their harm. No one could stand against them, because the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, the royal agents, they all aided the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. Mordecai was now great in the king's house, and his fame spread through all the provinces. In Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed the 10 sons of Haman. The text lists their names: Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arasai, Aradai, Vaizatha. It notes that the Jews did not lay hands on the plunder, though the decree had permitted it. They killed their enemies, but they took nothing. Throughout the provinces, 75,000 were killed on the 13th. On the 14th, the Jews in Susa killed 300 more men. Then they rested. The 14th of Adar became a day of feasting and gladness. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews in all the provinces, near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th and 15th of Adar every year as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday. They called these days Purim, after the Pur, the lot that Haman had cast to determine the day of destruction. The correction was surgical, generational, and complete. What Saul had failed to finish, Mordecai, a descendant of Saul's tribe, finished. The royal line of Agag, preserved in a moment of kingly vanity, was severed. Not just Haman, his 10 sons, the line itself. And it was done not in secret, but in the open, written into law, commemorated in an annual festival, embedded into the identity of a people who had come within one day of annihilation. But the structure beneath the story runs deeper than one failed decree. The conflict between Israel and Amalek was not geopolitical. It was existential. The Amalekites were not simply another neighboring tribe. According to the genealogies, they descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob, the twin who sold his birthright, who lost the blessing, who wept bitterly when he realized what he had traded away. Esau's grandson was Amalek, which means the enmity between Israel and Amalek was not the enmity of strangers. It was the enmity of family. The bitterness of a stolen blessing, passed down, concentrated, weaponized across generations. When the Amalekites attacked Israel in the wilderness, they were not acting as a foreign power. They were acting as the dispossessed branch of the same family tree. The attack was not strategic, it was personal. And God's command to eradicate them was not arbitrary cruelty. It was the severing of a genealogical threat, the elimination of a claim that, if allowed to endure, would contest the very identity of Israel forever. Saul's failure was not that he showed mercy. It was that he showed it to the one thing mercy could not be extended toward. He preserved the claim. He let the contest continue. And 3 centuries later, a man carrying that claim almost succeeded in reversing the entire covenant. Haman was not trying to kill Jews because Mordecai refused to bow. He was trying to kill Jews because he was Agag's heir, and they were Jacob's heirs. And the wound had never closed. The rabbinical tradition preserves a teaching. It says that in every generation, Amalek rises. Not as a nation, they were scattered, broken, genealogically diffused, but as a force. The tradition identifies Amalek not by geography or bloodline, but by a posture. Those who strike at the vulnerable from behind, who attack not to win territory but to erase memory, who make war not on soldiers but on identity itself. And here the ancient story pivots into the modern frame. The conflict, called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is typically framed as a dispute over land. Competing nationalisms, 2 peoples claiming the same territory. Borders drawn badly by colonial powers in 1917 and 1948. This framing is not false, but it is incomplete. It treats the conflict as a modern problem with modern solutions, negotiations, borders, recognition, rights. And every solution built on that frame has failed. Not because the people involved lack goodwill, but because the structure underneath is older and deeper than statehood. The modern state of Israel was declared on the 14th of May, 1948. The British Mandate ended at midnight. David Ben-Gurion read the Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv. Within hours, 5 Arab armies invaded: Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. The stated goal was not to reclaim specific territories. It was to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state entirely. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Azam Pasha, said in an interview with an Egyptian newspaper, "This will be a war of extermination and a momentous massacre which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades." The war lasted over a year. When it ended, Israel had survived. 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been expelled. The land was divided. But the goal, the eradication of the Jewish state, had not been abandoned. It had been postponed. In 1967, Egypt blockaded the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israeli shipping. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser moved troops into the Sinai and demanded the removal of UN peacekeepers. He declared, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel." Syria and Jordan joined the mobilization. Israel launched a preemptive strike. In 6 days, the war was over. Israel had taken the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and East Jerusalem. It was a military victory so total, it seemed to prove that the goal of eradication was no longer viable. But the goal did not change. The rhetoric did. In 1964, 3 years before Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded. Its charter stated clearly, "The partition of Palestine in 1947 and the establishment of the State of Israel are entirely illegal, regardless of the passage of time." The claim was not about the territories taken in 67. It was about the existence of the state itself. And the charter specified the method: armed struggle as the only way to liberate Palestine. Not negotiation, not recognition, liberation through elimination. This is not ancient history. In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections. Their charter, written in 1988, includes this line: "Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it." It cites a hadith that says, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him.'" This is not metaphor. This is not negotiating language. This is Amalek vocabulary. And here is where most analysis stops. It identifies the threat, catalogs the statements, documents the attacks, and then asks, what is the solution? More security? Better diplomacy? A two-state framework? International guarantees? But those answers all assume the conflict is instrumental, that it exists to achieve a goal, and if the goal is satisfied or the cost becomes too high, the conflict will end. That assumption works when you are dealing with nations. It does not work when you are dealing with something older. The question is not whether Palestinians deserve statehood. The question is not whether Israel has made mistakes. The question is, why does every concession fail to produce peace? Why did the Oslo Accords, which granted the Palestinians self-governing authority and international recognition, lead not to state building, but to the Second Intifada? Why did Israel's complete withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, every settlement dismantled, every soldier removed, lead not to peace, but to thousands of rockets fired into Israeli cities? Why does the pattern repeat? Because the conflict is not over borders, it is over existence, and existence is not negotiable. There is a detail buried in the historical record that most people miss entirely. In 1921, long before the State of Israel was established, riots broke out in Jaffa. Arab mobs attacked Jewish immigrants. 47 Jews were killed. The British Commission investigating the riots concluded that the violence was motivated by Arab fears of being swamped by Jewish immigration. Reasonable fears, perhaps. Demographic anxiety. Competition for resources. Except the riots did not target new immigrants alone. They targeted the oldest Jewish communities in the land. In Hebron, in 1929, a mob killed 67 Jews. These were not Zionist settlers. These were families who had lived in Hebron for centuries, long before modern Zionism existed. The rioters entered homes, killed men, women, and children, and mutilated the bodies. Survivors fled. The ancient Jewish community of Hebron, one of the four holy cities in Judaism, was erased. The violence preceded the state. It preceded the occupation. It preceded partition. It did not begin because of checkpoints or settlements or blockades. It began because the presence of Jews, not as rulers, not as occupiers, but simply as Jews, was intolerable to a portion of the population. And that intolerability was not new. It was the same intolerability that Haman expressed in Persia, that the Amalekites expressed in the wilderness, that Esau's bitterness carried into his grandson's legacy. The modern framing calls it nationalism, but nationalism is a claim to land. This is a claim to erasure. Nationalism negotiates borders. Erasure does not negotiate. It waits. After the 1948 war, Jordan occupied the West Bank and East Jerusalem. For 19 years, it controlled the Old City, the Western Wall, the Temple Mount. And during those 19 years, Jews were forbid to pray at the wall. Synagogues were destroyed. Gravestones from the Mount of Olives were used to build latrines. The Jordanian government did not allow Jewish access to the holy sites. Not Israelis, all Jews. And there was no international outcry. There was no UN resolution, because the issue was never actually access or administration. The issue was present. In 2000, at the Camp David Summit, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat a state in over 90% of the West Bank and all of Gaza, with East Jerusalem as its capital. President Clinton called it a generous offer. Arafat walked away. He did not make a counteroffer. He did not propose adjustments. He simply left. 2 months later, the Second Intifada began. Over 1,000 Israelis were killed, many in suicide bombings on buses, in cafes, at markets. The target was not military, it was civilian. The goal was not to pressure negotiations, it was to make daily life unlivable. Israel responded with checkpoints, barriers, and eventually, a separation wall. The international community condemned the wall as collective punishment, an obstacle to peace. And it was an obstacle. It was ugly, intrusive, and humiliating for Palestinians who had to pass through it daily. But it worked. Suicide bombings dropped by over 90%. The number of Israeli civilian deaths plummeted. The wall did not solve the conflict, but it stopped the hemorrhaging. And for that, Israel was condemned. Because security measures that work reveal the uncomfortable truth that the threat is real, ongoing, and not a product of misunderstanding. In 2008, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead in Gaza after years of rocket fire. In 2014, it launched Operation Protective Edge. In both cases, the stated goal was to stop the rockets and destroy the tunnels Hamas had built into Israeli territory. Tunnels designed not for supplies, but for infiltration and attacks. And in both cases, the international response focused almost exclusively on the number of Palestinian casualties. The asymmetry of deaths was presented as evidence of Israeli aggression. But asymmetry proves nothing about intent. It proves capability. Hamas fires thousands of rockets into Israeli cities. Most are intercepted by the Iron Dome defense system. Those that are not intercepted land in populated areas. They are simply less likely to kill because Israel has bomb shelters, early warning systems, and a population trained to take cover. Hamas does not. Or more precisely, Hamas uses its population as cover. Rockets are launched from schools, hospitals, residential buildings. Weapons are stored in mosques. Tunnels run beneath homes. This is not accidental, it is doctrinal. The more civilians die, the greater the international pressure on Israel to stop. The deaths are not a failure of the strategy, they are the strategy. Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel in the 1970s, said something that has been quoted, misquoted, and argued over ever since. We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. It is an unbearable sentence, but it names the mechanism. The conflict places Israel in a position where the choice is not between violence and peace. It is between being killed and killing those who hide among civilians while trying to kill you. There is no third option that both preserves life and satisfies those who will not stop until you are gone. And this is where the modern analysis fails most completely. It assumes that if Israel just made the right concessions, adopted the right policies, withdrew from the right territories, the violence would stop. But the violence has never been conditional on policy. It has been conditional on existence, and you cannot concede existence halfway. The rabbis teach that there are 3 oaths mentioned in the Song of Songs, interpreted as binding on Israel and the nations. Israel is bound not to rebel against the nations or immigrate to the land en masse before the time. The nations are bound not to oppress Israel excessively. The texts argue endlessly about whether the establishment of the modern state violated the first oath. But there is far less debate about whether the second has been violated. Exile was not supposed to mean extermination. Dispersion was not supposed to mean Auschwitz. When the nations broke their oath, when 6 million Jews were murdered in Europe while the world closed its borders and turned away ships full of refugees, the rabbinical framework shifted. The return was no longer rebellion. It was necessity. And necessity does not ask for permission. The Holocaust is often invoked as the justification for Israel's existence, and just as often dismissed as emotional blackmail. But the logic is simpler and harder than either frame allows. For 2,000 years, Jews survived as a minority in other people's countries. They were tolerated, expelled, massacred, tolerated again. The pattern repeated. Sometimes the persecutions were local, sometimes they were national, sometimes they were continental. But the pattern was consistent. Jews could live as guests, but only until the host population decided otherwise. And when that decision came, there was no appeal, no defense, no refuge. The synagogues burned, the communities fled, the graves were abandoned, and the survivors moved on, rebuilt, and waited for it to happen again. The State of Israel was not founded to solve the theological problem of exile. It was founded to solve the practical problem of survival. It is the one place where Jews do not need permission to exist, where self-defense is not a favor granted by a host, but a right exercised by a nation, where the question is not, will they tolerate us, but can they defeat us? And the answer for nearly 80 years has been no. But survival is not peace, and the absence of defeat is not victory. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not the same as the conflict with Amalek. Palestinians are not Amalekites. The analogy is not genealogical, but the structure is the same. A people who cannot be bargained with because the goal is not compromise. A threat that cannot be deterred because the cost of defeat is acceptable if it inflicts enough damage. An enemy defined not by what they want to gain, but by what they want to erase. And a response that must be total, sustained, and without illusion. Because the alternative is not occupation or injustice or bad optics. The alternative is annihilation. Israel has made mistakes. It has built settlements that complicate peace. It has used excessive force. It has allowed extremists in its own population to act with impunity. These are real failures, and they deserve real criticism. But none of them created the conflict. The conflict existed before the settlements, before the occupation, before the state. It existed when Jews were a small minority living in Ottoman Palestine. It existed when they were refugees fleeing pogroms in Europe. It existed when they were a landless people scattered across empires. The conflict is not about what Israel does. It is about what Israel is. And that is the detail most analyses refuse to see. Because if the conflict is about actions, it can be solved by changing actions. But if the conflict is about existence, the only solutions are victory or extinction. And victory does not mean conquest. It means endurance. It means outlasting the will to destroy you. It means surviving long enough that the next generation asks different questions. Mordecai did not negotiate with Haman. Esther did not offer a compromise. They did not try to address Haman's grievances or find common ground. They exposed the threat, reversed the decree, and killed everyone who tried to carry it out. Then they wrote it into law, turned it into a festival, and taught their children to remember it every year. Not as a tragedy, as a victory. And the victory was not that they killed their enemies. The victory was that they survived. The State of Israel has survived 5 major wars, 2 intifadas, thousands of rockets, waves of suicide bombings, international isolation, and a diplomatic framework that holds it to standards applied to no other nation. It has absorbed millions of refugees from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and the former Soviet Union. It has built an economy, a military, a culture. It has turned a desert into farmland and a refugee population into a regional power. And it has done all of this while surrounded by neighbors who, in many cases, still refuse to recognize its right to exist. That is not a conflict, that is a siege. And sieges do not end with negotiations. They end when one side breaks or the other gives up. But there is a generation growing up now, both Israeli and Palestinian, that does not remember the wars. They remember checkpoints, they remember rockets and sirens, they remember funerals, and they are tired. Not of the conflict, but of the posture. The Israeli right says, we cannot afford to concede because concessions are interpreted as weakness, and weakness invites attack. The Israeli left says, we cannot afford to continue because occupation corrupts, and eventually we will lose the moral authority that justifies our existence. Both are correct, and both are trapped by the same problem. The conflict is not in their hands. Because the people who want peace cannot make it happen, and the people who can make it happen do not want peace. They want victory. And by victory, they do not mean security or borders or recognition. They mean the end of Israel. And as long as that remains the goal, spoken or unspoken, official or unofficial, in charters or classrooms or sermons, every gesture toward peace is a gamble with existential stakes. So what do you do when the threat is real, ongoing, and unjust, but also unsolvable by the means you are willing to use? You do what Mordecai did. You survive. You document. You teach your children who tried to kill them and why. You build the systems that make survival possible. The walls, the intelligence, the shelters, the alliances. You do not apologize for existing. You do not wait for permission to defend yourself. And you accept that the cost of survival is that you will be hated for it. Because the alternative is to be mourned, and mourning does not bring anyone back. There is a ceremony held every year in Israel on Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. At 10 in the morning, a siren sounds across the entire country. For 2 minutes, everything stops. Cars pull over, people stand in the street, buses halt mid-route, passengers step out and stand in silence. The whole nation stops. And in that silence, they remember the 6 million who did not survive because there was no state to defend them, no army to fight for them, no place that would take them in. Then the siren ends, and life resumes. That is the structure underneath everything. The memory of what happens when you do not have the power to say no. When survival depends on the kindness of others. When you are guests in someone else's country and the lease can be revoked at any time. Israel is the refusal of that condition. It is the insistence that Jews will not go quietly again. That the next time someone tries, there will be a fight. And the fight will not be fair, because fairness is a luxury you can only afford when your existence is not at stake. The conflict will not end in our lifetime. It may not end in the next, because the structure that sustains it is not political. It is mythological. It is written into identity, into sacred text, into the stories people tell their children about who they are and who their enemies are. And myths do not die. They go dormant. They wait. And when the conditions are right, they wake. But survival is also a myth. And the myth of survival has one advantage. It does not require the enemy's consent. You cannot negotiate with Amalek. You can only outlast it. And outlasting is not a strategy. It is a fact. The people who wanted to destroy you are gone, and you are still here. That is not justice. It is not peace, but it is continuation. And continuation is the only victory that matters when the alternative is erasure. So what is your Agag? What is the thing you were told to destroy completely? The compromise you made, the concession you justified, the seed you planted in mercy that has now grown roots. What is the voice you spared because killing it felt too extreme, too harsh, too final? And now it speaks in your children's ears, distorts your values, contests your identity, and threatens the thing you were supposed to protect. Saul spared Agag because he wanted to look like a king. He wanted the symbols of victory without the cost. He wanted the monument, the spoils, the living proof of conquest. And in doing so, he preserved the one thing that would unravel everything 300 years later. Not immediately, not obviously, but inevitably. You know what it is. The relationship you keep because ending it would look cruel. The compromise you make because holding the line would cost you socially. The pattern you excuse because naming it would force a choice you are not ready to make. The ideology you tolerate because confronting it would divide your house. You have been told what it is. You have been shown the cost. And you have chosen the monument over the mission. And 6 generations from now, someone who carries your name will stand in a palace, or a courtroom, or a hospital, or a ruined home. And the thing you spared will be holding the blade. The redemptive image is this. Esther went before the king unbidden, knowing she might die. She did not wait for permission. She did not ask if the time was right. She stepped into the gap between the decree and the day of slaughter, and she used the only power she had, access, presence, voice, to reverse what seemed irreversible. And it worked. Not because she was braver than everyone else, but because she acted while action was still possible. The correction is available. It is surgical, it is generational, and it is complete. But only if you stop waiting for a better moment. Write the word continuation if this landed. Share this with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe. There is more coming you will not want to miss. The city of Susa stands in ruins now in southwestern Iran. The palace is gone, the archives are dust. But every year, on the 14th of Adar, Jews around the world read the scroll of Esther aloud. They read the names of Haman's 10 sons in one breath, so that no individual name is honored, so that the line is remembered only as a line that ended. And when the name Haman is read, they make noise, they stomp, they use rattles, they shout, so that the sound of his name is drowned out. In that place, to this day, you cannot hear him clearly. The noise is louder than the name. The people are still here, and Amalek is not.